Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak in support of the Custodial Inspector Amendment Protection from Reprisal Bill 2025, and I acknowledge the Custodial Inspector Act was brought in almost a decade ago, and there have been only minor consequential amendments since, as the member for Hobart pointed out, and I thank the member for Hobart for bringing this bill to us in this place today. So only minor consequential amendments over the past decade, despite the fact that the annual reports of the Custodial Inspector in 2020-21 and 2022-23 made recommendations for amendments to improve the capacity of the Custodial Inspector to effectively perform their role, improve the governance and timeliness of reports to the Parliament, and importantly, to ensure people feel safe and protected in speaking out and reporting issues to the Custodial Inspector. Mr President, it's disappointing that the government hasn't acted on these recommendations sooner, but really it's fortunate that we have a minority government and a parliament with non-government members who have the motivation, the passion and resources to listen to and act on recommendations by our independent authorities. And again, I thank the Greens and the member for Hobart for their work in bringing these amendments to the Parliament. I'm pleased the government saw sense through the hiatus caused by the unnecessary recent election and changed their mind on this and on their initial opposition to these amendments that were voiced in the other place earlier in the year when the bill was first tabled. To the specific amendments, I'm supportive of them all, but I do have a couple of questions I'd like the Greens member to answer in reply if they are able to, please, and I'll summarise my support for the amendments and ask the questions as I go along. Of course, it makes sense that the Custodial Inspector tables their reports in the Parliament rather than this power or responsibility resting with the Minister, and I understand that this is consistent with other independent statutory authorities, including the Integrity Commission, Commissioner for Children and Young People and the National Preventive Mechanism, or NPM, under OPCAT, a role that's concurrently held by our Custodial Inspector. Mr President, as is the role of Ombudsman, which can also table their own reports, as can the Auditor-General. So I support the amendments to Section 15 to enable the Custodial Inspector to table their own reports in the Parliament and to shorten the period within which the report is tabled to be within 7 days or 14 days, as per the proposed amendment of providing a copy to the Minister, rather than within 30 days as the current Act provides. Ultimately, Mr President, I support it being sooner. I do note that the Health Complaints Commissioner, a role that is also concurrently held by the Ombudsman, together with the roles of NPM and Custodial Inspector, cannot table their own health complaint reports, which would now appear to be an anomaly that perhaps needs addressing. Not a question for the Greens, but perhaps something the government can consider, unless there is good reason why the Health Commissioner should not or cannot table their own reports in Parliament. Now, speaking of all these statutory roles and responsibilities allocated to one independent person, what a task that is, Mr President. And whilst the government has or likely may talk up the fact that theoretically we're leading the nation in that our Ombudsman has the power to visit all places of deprivation of liberty, it's no use having the power if you don't have the resources to carry out this role effectively. In a media release of 18th of October 2024, then Custodial Inspector /NPM Richard Connock reiterated his earlier calls for more funding for the Office of the National Preventative Mechanism. In releasing the Office of the Custodial Inspector Annual Report 2023-24, Mr Connock expressed his disappointment that the establishment of the Office of the Tasmanian National Preventative Mechanism, or NPM, had stalled due to a lack of government funding, saying, and I quote, "The NPM represents an opportunity to expand the proactive mandate of the Custodial Inspector to prevent ill treatment in police and court custody, and importantly to non-custodial settings. This includes places such as secure mental health facilities, aged residential care and disability support settings. Successive Royal Commissions and Commissions of Inquiry have highlighted the need for increased monitoring in these places where people are deprived of their liberty. Despite significant investment from the Tasmanian Government to scope the requirements of establishing the Tasmanian NPM, the recommendations arising from this project have been met with relative silence. It is my hope that the next NPM will be able to build upon the nation-leading work done in Tasmania to date. This includes demonstrating the benefit increased monitoring will have in preventing ill treatment in Tasmania, where people are deprived of their liberty, custodial or otherwise. However, appropriate funding will be essential for the MPM to fulfill its mandate, Mr Connock said, end quote. Mr President, Mr Connock could not be clearer on the need for increased funding if this important role is to be carried out effectively. So I really hope this week's budget reflects that, else the government had better stop suggesting it's leading the nation in this area, because it actually isn't in practice and can't unless it properly resources it. I note and apologise that I digress a little from the contents of the bill. However, part of the intent of the bill, insofar as I see it, is to ensure the custodial inspector can effectively perform their roles. An adequate budget is critical to that. I'll take every opportunity to put on the record my support for the calls of independent oversight authorities to be properly resourced, else there is little point having them. And there have been quite a number of them established under this government, and even in my short time in this place so far, Mr President. It's a shame we live in a society where we need them, but we do, and they are vital for protecting some of the most vulnerable people in our community. Back to the amendments proposed in this bill. Of course, I support amendments to Section 25 to protect people who come forward and report issues to the Office of the Custodial Inspector. People should never be held back from doing so for fear of retribution. Not staff members, nor family members, or people in custody themselves, no one. In the media release of 18th of October 2024, then Custodial Inspector Richard Connock reiterated his call on the state government for adequate protection from reprisals for people raising concerns with his office, saying, and I quote, "If the teenager who initially reported the hostile management regime hadn't done so due to fear of reprisal, then we wouldn't have been able to raise it with TPS and have it stopped. While people can contact us anonymously and we strive to protect the identity of people who provide us with information, sometimes assumptions and conclusions can be drawn from the circumstances being reviewed and reported on. There are no protections against reprisal targeting those who have spoken with my office. There should be. It is important that the state government address this legislative defect in the interest of improving the welfare of people in custody and those who work with them," Mr Connock said. Mr President, there's an example of where something may not have been changed if the brave teenager who reported it had feared reprisal. Sadly, we don't know how many issues haven't been reported over the last decade because these legislative provisions have not existed. We can't change that, we can't change the past, but we can put those protections in place from now on, and we should, as Mr Connock said. I also support the amendments to Section 10 of the Act in relation to delegation of the custodial inspector's functions and powers to include any person appointed by the inspector for the purposes of the carrying out of an inspection. And I understand the rationale outlined in the second reading speech for this. However, my question is, by what process is any person appointed, and is there a register of persons appointed that is maintained? I also wondered whether consideration was given to amending the regulations to cover this delegation under the existing provision 10B in the Act, which provides for a person or class of persons prescribed by the regulations, rather than amending the Act. I support the amendment to Section 24 to enable the custodial inspector to disclose information to a public authority or the minister, and I note public authority has the same meaning as that defined in the Ombudsman Act 1978. The changes to Section 34 relating to the protection for provision of information make sense and goes hand in hand with the amendments to Section 25. However, I note, Mr President, it is a fair departure from the current wording. So I wonder if the member for Hobart, in summing up, can please detail how this wording was arrived at and whether it exists in any other acts. I also wonder if the member for Hobart can clarify how is in good faith defined or tested as well. And finally, does the inclusion of whether the information is true or false mean a person could make false claims about the conduct of another with no recourse for defamation? To finish, Mr President, I note the work of the Office of the Custodial Inspector and thank all of the staff for the work they undertake across the breadth of roles and responsibilities assigned to this office by statute. I thank Richard Connock for his service to Tasmania and its people in the role, and I welcome Grant Davies to the roles of Ombudsman, Custodial Inspector, Health Complaints Commissioner, National Preventative Mechanism and Coordinator of the Official Visitors Program. I wish him all the very best in continuing on the calls of Mr Connock in convincing the government to separate and appropriately resource these roles. I support the Custodial Inspector Protection from Reprisal Bill.